On a Wednesday afternoon in August of 1983, at the fence line between his 520 acres of short grass cattle range and the 87 acres of seed corn belonging to his neighbor Wendell Marsh, a cattleman named Bennett Rooker stood beside his brand new fire engine, red Ford F250, and laughed. He did not laugh quietly. He laughed the way a man laughs when he wants to make certain that every person within a quarter mile understands exactly who has won and who has lost. He had driven his new truck, the 1983 model with the chrome trim, still polished from the dealership in Colby, right up to the property line. He stood with one boot hooked on the bumper and his thumbs pushed into a belt with a silver buckle the size of a saucer. He looked across the fence at the cracked pale earth of Wendell's South Quarter, where 87 acres of seed corn were slowly dying in the worst heat Decatur County, Kansas had seen in August since 1956. And he said loud enough to carry across 3 pasture lots, loud enough for the 2 hired men stacking hay bales on the other side of the road to hear every word. "Wendell, I've been telling you for 10 years the Ogallala is dropping. You can't farm with faith in a dowsing rod. Those 87 acres need to go to the corporation out of good land before the bank takes them anyway. Time to face facts, old man." Wendell Marsh stood on his side of the fence and said nothing. His well had gone dry 5 days ago. Not slowly, not the gradual drop that gives a man time to think. It had quit suddenly, the way a heart quits. One Sunday morning, it was pumping water at 7 gallons a minute for the old iron tank by the barn. Monday morning, it was pulling air. 87 acres of Pioneer high-bred seed corn under contract. 18 days before pollination and no water in the ground to carry them through the driest week of the driest August any man in that county could remember. The extension agent, a young man named Dean Whitaker out of the Oberlin office, had come by on Monday afternoon. Dean had walked the property, checked the well. Casing looked at his own clipboard with a frown that was half professional and half personal, and told Wendell what Wendell had already known the moment the pump began to cough. "The perched water table your 1952 well taps into has drawn down below the pump intake. Looking at the Kansas Geological Survey maps, you would need to go down to at least 180 feet to tap into the deeper Ogallala around here, and that is if you can find it at all. The estimate is $3,800 minimum for drilling, and there are no guarantees with the bedrock in this section." Wendell had $4,200 in his savings account at the First State Bank of Oberlin. It was also everything he had in the bank. He had driven the 1.25 miles to Bennett Rooker's place the next morning, Tuesday, and he had asked Bennett whether he might buy water access from one of the 3 pivot wells Bennett had drilled in 1972, 1974, and 1976 with federal cost share money from the conservation program. The wells ran deep, 240 feet each. They had produced strong for over a decade. Wendell had offered to pay a fair rate, whatever Bennett considered fair, for the water he would need to carry the seed corn through pollination and into the dent stage. He had not asked to borrow. He had asked to buy. Bennett Rooker had smiled first. Then he had said, "Wendell, I've got my own cattle operation to run. I can't be piping water to every patch of dry farm ground in Decatur County." Then he had climbed into his red truck and driven the 2.5 miles to the fence line, and he had stood with his boot on the bumper, and he had laughed. The seed corn would be dead in 10 days without water. In 20, the plants would be unsalvageable, and the Pioneer hybrid contract would be voided. But Wendell was 63 years old. He had farmed the same 87 acres for 47 years. His wife Eleanor had died in the winter of 1978 from a stroke at 56. His daughter Clara was 38, teaching 3rd grade in Lincoln, Nebraska, and she called every Sunday and sent a card on his birthday. If the crop failed, there was no recovery. Not at 63, not with $4,200 in the bank, and a mortgage that still had 11 years left on the note. 2 neighbors had tried to help. Jim Pauley, who farmed the 320 acres directly east, offered to let Wendell run a temporary line from the cattle pond by the south windbreak. But the pond water was heavy with algae by August and thick with silt from the spring runoff, and it would have clogged the irrigation nozzles within 4 days. Merle Hoffstetter, who ran the farmer-owned co-op in Oberlin and had been Wendell's friend for 40 years, had made calls to a water hauling service out of Atwood. But the hauler wanted $385 per load, and Wendell's 87 acres would need at minimum 3 loads a week just to keep the plants alive. $1,155 a week. The math did not require a pencil. By the end of the first week, the leaves on the outer rows had begun to curl and roll tight against their own stems, the way corn does when it gives up on the sun. By the end of the second, the curling had marched inward toward the center of the field row by row like a slow fire. Dean Whitaker came back on Friday, looked at the plants, and said what his notebook already said. The seed corn had perhaps one more week before the tassels emerged into heat they could not survive. After that, no amount of water would bring back what had been lost. The situation felt completely sealed. Wendell stood at the fence and received Bennett Rooker's laughter without changing his expression. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not even look up at the red truck. He simply turned and walked back across the stubble toward his farmhouse, and Bennett Rooker, watching him go, mistook that silence for defeat. It was not defeat, it was memory. Now let me tell you what Wendell Marsh was carrying inside him that Wednesday afternoon, because Bennett Rooker had no idea what had just been set in motion. Neither did Dean Whitaker with his clipboard. Neither did the 2 hired men stacking bales. Neither did any other soul in Decatur County, Kansas. Let me tell you about Wendell Marsh, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did next. Wendell was born in April of 1920 on this same 87 acres, the third of 4 children, the only boy. His older sisters, Ruth and Hazel, were both gone by 1983, Ruth to cancer in 1974, and Hazel to a car accident on Highway 83 outside Oakley in 1967. His younger sister Miriam lived in Topeka with her husband and 2 grandchildren and visited every Thanksgiving. Wendell had worked the land beside his father Henry Marsh from the age of 8. His father, a quiet man who had farmed this property since 1908, when he had bought it at 22, with money saved from 3 years of railroad work on the Rock Island line, understood the place the way a man understands something he has studied every single day for 5 decades. Not from books, not from the Kansas State Extension pamphlets that came in the mail, not from the USDA bulletins. From presence, from walking the ground in every season and every weather and paying attention to what it told him each time. Henry Marsh was not an educated man by any formal measure. He had finished the 6th grade in a 1-room schoolhouse 3 miles northeast of Oberlin and had been farming full-time since he was 13. But he had a quality that formal education does not reliably produce and cannot replace. He observed the land without assumptions, and he remembered everything he observed. In over 40 years of doing this, he had built a knowledge of his specific piece of ground that no instrument and no survey and no well driller and no county extension agent could fully replicate. In the summer of 1936, when Wendell was 16 years old, the Dust Bowl reached its deepest year on the high plains of western Kansas. The rains had failed in 1934. The rains had failed again in 1935. By June of 1936, the soil across Decatur County was blowing in a fine gray powder that settled on the windowsills each morning and sifted through the cracks around the doors and got between your teeth when you ate. The windmill at the Marsh farm, installed by Wendell's grandfather Ezra in 1912 over a well drilled to 75 feet, slowed in May. By mid-June, it was pulling nothing but the sound of dry leather against dry steel. The family had 4 mouths to feed, 15 head of cattle, and a kitchen garden that had kept them alive through worse already. Henry Marsh did not panic. He walked the north fence line for 5 mornings in a row, slowly and without explanation, stopping at different points, crouching to pick up soil, and smell it pressing the toe of his boot into the cracked ground. On the 6th morning, he took Wendell with him. They walked the full length of the old drainage together. Henry moving without speaking, Wendell watching him the way a boy watches a man he already knows is worth watching. There was a buffalo wallow that ran across the north end of the property, a long, shallow depression, maybe 18 inches deep and 150 yards long, running roughly north to south. It had been there before the Marsh family arrived. It had been there before white settlement. It had been made centuries before by the herds that had moved across that country following the water, and the water had carved a channel at depth that the wallow on the surface was only the faintest memory of. At a particular bend in the wallow, a subtle tightening where the depression narrowed slightly and the western edge rose half a foot higher than the eastern edge, Henry Marsh stopped. He crouched down. He pressed both his palms flat against the earth and he held them there without speaking. Wendell stood beside his father and waited. He counted in his own head without meaning to. Nearly 3 full minutes passed. The wind moved across the dry grass and the sun climbed another inch. Then Henry Marsh looked up at his son and said, "Wendell, the water does not disappear. It just goes somewhere else. Your job is to figure out where it went." He explained it in the plain language of a man who has learned something by watching rather than reading. The wallow was dry on the surface, had been dry for as long as anyone could remember. But the channel that the water had cut over the centuries did not cease to exist just because the surface water had gone. Underground, following the same geometry, water was still moving, just deeper than it used to be. The land remembered every channel that had ever run through it. The deep geology held the shape of those ancient drainages the way a scar holds the shape of a wound. Water moving through porous gravel and fractured rock far below the surface followed those shapes because the shapes were easier than any alternative. Henry showed Wendell how to read the signs that marked where this underground movement came closest to the surface. Where the frost lingered longest in March along the wallow's path, the cold from below was nearest the ground. Where the buffalo grass stayed greenest the longest into July after the rest of the pasture had brown moisture was wicking upward from depth. Where the bend in the dry channel tightened and narrowed, the underground flow slowed and collected building pressure, concentrating in a smaller volume. At that bend in the old buffalo wallow on the north side of the Marsh property, all 3 signs were present together. Henry drilled a new well that summer at the exact spot he had identified. He went down 125 feet, 50 feet deeper than any well on neighboring properties at that time, far deeper than most men in the county would have considered practical. The Crane brothers out of Oberlin did the drilling. The old man, the first Crane who had been drilling wells in that country since 1912, looked at the location Henry had picked and said most people would put it closer to the barn. Henry said the water is here. He hit water at 125 feet. It came up cold and fast, 14 gallons per minute, holding steady. Old Crane said it was the best yield he had seen in 20 years of well work in Decatur County. That well carried the Marsh farm through 1936, 1937, 1938, and every dry summer that followed for over 20 years. Henry had never drilled a second well because he had never needed one. On the day the water came in, Henry had sat beside his son on the running board of the drilling truck and said, "Wendell, the men who survive the dry years are not the ones with the most money or the best equipment. They are the ones who already understood their land before the drought started. When the crisis comes, it is too late to start learning. The knowledge has to be inside you, and it has to have been inside you for a long time." Wendell had carried those words for 47 years. Let me tell you what that means. Every spring from the April after his father told him that until the April of 1983, when his own well went dry, Wendell Marsh walked the north fence line. He walked it slowly. He stopped at the bend in the buffalo wallow. He pressed the toe of his boot into the soil. He watched the frost in March. He checked the darkness of the earth after the spring rains. He crouched at the bend and pressed his palms flat against the ground the way his father had shown him. 47 years, 47 Aprils. Not because the well was failing, not because he needed anything. He did it because his father had taught him that knowledge unused goes cold. And cold knowledge fails you when you finally need it most. Eleanor, his wife, had watched him do this every April for the 34 years they were married. She had said to him once in the spring of 1969, when they had been married for 25 years, "Wendell, you walk that same path every April like it is church. And Wendell had said, Eleanor it is. He had known what was underneath his land for 47 years before his well ever failed. He had known it Tuesday morning when he drove over and asked Bennett Rooker for water. He had gone to Bennett first because purchasing access to an existing well was faster and cheaper than drilling a new one. And because Wendell Marsh had always believed that the straightforward path deserved to be tried before the harder one. Bennett had been his neighbor for 16 years. It had seemed worth asking. But Bennett had laughed. And now Wendell walked back to his farmhouse in the August heat with that laughter still hanging in the air behind him. And 47 years of his father's teaching settled quietly inside him. And he sat down at the kitchen table with a pencil and a lined tablet, and he did the arithmetic one final time. Let me tell you about Bennett Rooker, too, since we are talking about men. Bennett was 58 years old that August, a third-generation cattleman. His grandfather had homesteaded 160 acres southeast of Oberlin in 1887, and his father had built that up to 320 acres by the time of the Second World War. Bennett had inherited in 1969 when his father died of a stroke at the auction ring in Oberlin, and Bennett had then done what his grandfather and father had never done. He had borrowed. He had borrowed hard and fast from the farm credit system between 1972 and 1979 and expanding to 520 acres, installing the 3-center pivots, buying a new international tractor every 4 years, replacing the truck every 3. He wore pressed Wranglers that never saw real work. He wore pearl snap shirts with mother-of-pearl buttons. He wore the silver belt buckle and a gold Masonic ring on his right hand. He called men who were older than him son, and he called men his own age boy, and he spoke in the loud voice of a man who needs to hear himself being heard. His wife Doreen managed the books and did not say much at public gatherings. Bennett did not know what Wendell had in his bank account. Bennett did not know about Henry Marsh. Bennett did not know about the buffalo wallow on the north fence line. Bennett had spent 10 years laughing at Wendell Marsh behind his back and occasionally to his face calling him a museum piece, calling his 87 acres a hobby, telling anyone who would listen at the cafe in Oberlin that the future of Decatur County was in operations like his 500-plus acres deep well center, pivots, corporate scale. Bennett believed it. It was not a performance. He actually believed it. Let me tell you about the year 1983 in American agriculture, because you need to understand what the ground was like under every farmer's feet that summer. The prime interest rate was sitting at 10.5%. The farm credit system was under pressure that nobody outside the banks fully understood yet, though everyone would understand it by 1985. The Payment in Kind program had just been announced by the Reagan administration in January, paying farmers to leave ground out of production in exchange for surplus grain from government stocks. Corn was trading at $3.18 a bushel at the Oberlin elevator, which was below cost of production for most operators. The Ogallala Aquifer, which lay beneath the feet of every farmer in western Kansas, had dropped an average of 12 feet across the region since 1960. Between 1980 and 1983, 47 farms in Decatur County alone had been foreclosed or auctioned. The sale barn in Oberlin was packed every Thursday with equipment and livestock being liquidated. Farmland values had fallen 38% from their 1981 peak. The suicide rate among Kansas farmers was 3 times the national average. That was the ground Wendell Marsh was standing on when he sat down at the kitchen table with his pencil and his tablet and $4,200 in the bank and 87 acres of dying seed corn in the ground. Clara had called on Monday night when she heard about the well. She had driven down from Lincoln on the Greyhound on Tuesday evening and gotten in at 11 at night, and Wendell had picked her up at the bus station in Oberlin. They had driven back to the farm in silence because there was not much to say, and then on Wednesday morning, they had walked out across the south field together, and Clara had looked at the curling leaves of the seed corn, and she had said, "Dad, I can take leave without pay from the school. I have some savings. Let me help." Wendell had stopped walking, and he had turned to his daughter, and he had said, "Clara, your mother and I raised you to be a teacher. We did not raise you to underwrite a failed farm. You keep your money, keep your job." I have something I need to try first. Clara had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said, "You are going to drill a new well, aren't you?" Wendell had said yes. Clara had said where. Wendell had said at the bend. Clara had said nothing for another moment. She had grown up on that farm. She had walked the north fence line with her father many April mornings when she was young. She knew about the bend. She knew about her grandfather Henry, who had died when she was 16 years old in the winter of 1961. She knew the story of 1936. Then Clara had said, "I am staying through the weekend. I am going to be here when the drill truck comes." Wendell had nodded once and they had walked back to the house, and that was the only conversation on the subject that they had needed to have. Now it was Wednesday afternoon, and Bennett Rooker had laughed at the fence, and Wendell was at the kitchen table with the arithmetic in front of him. $4,200 in the bank. Dean Whitaker had quoted $3,800 for drilling at the depth the extension office was recommending, which would leave $400 for the pump installation and the electrical permit and whatever else the unforeseen would demand. If the well came in as Wendell expected, it would, based on what his father had shown him 47 years ago and what he had verified with his hands and his feet every spring, since $400 would be enough. If it did not come in, if he had been wrong about what his father had shown him, if 47 years of walking that fence line had produced a false confidence instead of a true one, he would have spent nearly everything he had on a dry hole with a failed crop in the ground and a mortgage 11 years from paid off. He sat with that possibility for a long time. He turned it over in his mind the way a man turns over a stone to see what is underneath it. He thought about his father's palms pressed flat against the earth. He thought about the soil that stayed darker at the bend. He thought about the frost in March. He thought about 14 gallons per minute coming up cold and fast in the summer of 1936 from 125 feet down. He thought about Eleanor saying it was church. He thought about Clara upstairs unpacking her weekend bag. Then he got up and picked up the phone. He called the operator and asked her to put him through to the Crane brothers drilling in Oberlin. Let me tell you about Orville Crane because his family had been drilling wells in that part of Kansas since 1912, and the man who answered the phone that Wednesday afternoon was the third generation of his line to do the work. Orville was 54 years old. He had learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from Orville's grandfather. He had drilled his first well unsupervised at the age of 20. He had put in over 600 wells across 5 counties in 34 years, and he had a reputation in western Kansas for 2 things. The first was that he did not walk away from a hole until he had answered whatever question the hole was asking. The second was that he respected local knowledge. Wendell had chosen Crane Brothers for specifically the second reason. When Wendell explained what he wanted the location of the drill site 420 feet from the barn at the bend in the Buffalo Wallow along the north fence line, Orville Crane was quiet on the other end of the phone for a long moment. Then Orville said, "Mr. Marsh, that is not where an engineer would put that well." Wendell said, "My father drilled 250 yards south of there in 1936 and hit water at 125 feet. The bend runs under my north line. I know what is underneath this ground." Orville said, "Your father was Henry Marsh." Wendell said, "Yes." Orville said, "My grandfather drilled that well for him. My father was on the crew that summer as a young man just starting in the trade. I grew up hearing that story. My grandfather used to say that Henry Marsh read the country the way the county agent read his own paychecks, and that the Marsh well at the bend was the one he was proudest of in 30 years of work." There was a pause on the line. Then Orville said, "We can be out there Tuesday morning, the 23rd. Day after tomorrow, I've got a job in Norton. I will bring the cable tool rig. We will go down as far as we need to." Wendell said, "Thank you." He hung up the phone. Dean Whitaker stopped by the farm that evening. He had heard from somebody because in a small county, nothing stays quiet for more than about 4 hours that Wendell had booked Crane Brothers. Dean was a decent young man, 29 years old recently, out of Kansas State, with a master's in agronomy, sincere in his wish to help the farmers of his district. He meant well. He stood on Wendell's porch with his clipboard, and he said, "Mr. Marsh, I respect what you are trying to do, but I have to tell you what my training tells me. Modern hydrology says the Ogallala drawdown in this zone is unpredictable beyond the perch tables. I would recommend we call the state geologist out of Hayes first and have him run a ground-penetrating radar survey before you commit to a specific drill site. It costs $200 a day plus travel. It could save you from putting your money in the wrong hole. Wendell listened politely until Dean was finished. Then Wendell said, "Dean, I appreciate you. I appreciate that you came out here on a Wednesday evening. I am going to go ahead with Crane Brothers on a Tuesday. I have my reasons. If I am wrong, I will own it. If I am right, I will own that too." Dean opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he said, "Yes, sir." He got back in his county vehicle and he drove off toward Oberlin. The story moved through Decatur County at the speed that important news always moves in farming communities. Through Hoffstetter's co-op on Thursday morning, through the parking lot of the grain elevator on Thursday afternoon, through the booths of the Silver Dollar Cafe on Highway 36 on Friday at breakfast, where the same men had been sitting in the same booths for 30 years. Wendell Marsh was drilling at the bend. Wendell Marsh was going to sink his last dollar in a dowsing hole. Bennett Rooker was right about him. Marsh is going to lose the place. It is sad to see. Not all of it was cruel. Some of it was worried, said by men who had known Wendell his whole life and who did not want to see him lose the farm. Men who did not have the specific knowledge he had and therefore could not share his confidence, could only share their fear for him. But worry from a friend when you know what you are doing and they do not lands almost the same as mockery. It lands as a weight on your back that you have to carry while you walk forward. Wendell drove to the co-op on Friday afternoon to pick up a sack of pump fittings for the installation that would happen after the drilling if there was a drilling to finish. Merle Hoffstetter was behind the counter. Merle was 71 years old. He had bought into the co-op in 1948 and had run it since 1961. And he had known Henry Marsh back in the 1950s when Henry was still the man of the Marsh farm. Merle was planning to retire at the end of 1983. He had told Wendell about the retirement decision back in June before any of this had started. Merle came around the counter when Wendell walked in. He put his hand on Wendell's shoulder, not firmly, just contact. He said, "Wendell, I heard the talk. I want you to know something. I knew your father. I did business with him for 11 years before he passed. Your father could read land the way some men read a newspaper. He did not guess. He did not douse. He watched and he remembered and he thought. If you walked the north fence with him as a boy and you paid attention, and if you kept walking it after he was gone, you know what is underneath that ground. Modern hydrogeologists have instruments. Your father had 40 years of looking. I will take 40 years of looking over any instrument." Wendell looked at Merle, and for the first time since Monday, he felt the grip around his chest loosen a little. Wendell said, "Thank you, Merle." Merle said, "You pay me for those fittings on Monday. Go home and get some sleep. Tuesday is coming." Wendell drove home in the late afternoon light. The wheat stubble along the road was pale gold against the washed-out sky. The cottonwoods along the draw near the highway were holding their leaves, but the leaves were dull, waiting for rain that was not in the forecast. He took the long way home north, past the school, and east along the gravel so that he would drive past the bend in the fence line from the outside, the way a man passes a church on a weekday when he is not going in but just wants to see that it is still there. He stopped the truck at the gravel turnout near the corner post. He got out. He walked 30 feet along the fence, and he stood at the bend, and he looked across his own ground at the spot where, if he was right about everything his father had ever taught him, the Crane Brothers cable tool rig was going to break through into cold water on Tuesday afternoon at somewhere between 140 and 160 feet down. He crouched. He pressed both palms flat against the earth. He held them there without speaking the way his father had held his in the summer of 1936. He counted to himself without meaning to. Nearly 3 full minutes passed. The wind moved across the dry grass. The sun dropped another inch. The knowledge was there. It had been there all along. It had been there for centuries before a single Marsh had set foot on the property. Wendell stood up. He wiped his palms on his jeans. He walked back to the truck. Orville Crane's truck was coming down the county road Tuesday morning. But before it arrived, Bennett Rooker was going to see something from the seat of his red Ford F250 and what he was going to say to himself when he saw it was going to haunt him for the next 6 years. Tuesday morning, August 23rd, 1983, came in hot before the sun was fully clear of the horizon. The thermometer on the back porch of the Marsh farmhouse read 74 degrees at 6 in the morning, and by 7 it was past 80. There was no cloud anywhere in the eastern sky. The wind had dropped to nothing overnight, which on the Kansas plains in August means the heat is going to climb straight up without any interruption. Wendell Marsh had been awake since 4:30. He had made coffee in the blue enamel percolator that Eleanor had bought at a hardware store in Norton in 1961, and he had drunk 2 cups at the kitchen table in the dark while Clara slept upstairs in her old room. He had not looked at the clock, but he had known by the quality of the silence that it was early. At 6:15, he had walked out to the barn and fed the 8 beef cows he still kept in the north pen more for company than for profit. He had checked the water tank, which he had been filling with 5-gallon jugs hauled from the co-op in Oberlin, since his well had failed, and he had poured 2 fresh jugs into the tank to keep the cattle through the morning. He had then walked down the gravel lane to the county road and back, not for any reason, just to walk. Clara had come downstairs at 7, and she had fried eggs and bacon for both of them without asking whether he wanted breakfast, and they had eaten together without speaking much. At 7:30, Clara had said, "What time are they supposed to be here?" Wendell had said Orville said 8. At 8 in the morning, the road was still empty. Let me tell you about the sound that came down that county road at 8 minutes past 8 that Tuesday morning, because if you grew up in farm country in the 1950s and 1960s, you have heard it yourself. And if you did not grow up in farm country, I want you to be able to hear it now. It came up from the south, carried on the still morning air, across the flat ground for more than a mile, before Wendell and Clara, standing on the front porch of the farmhouse, could see any vehicle on the county road at all. The first thing they heard was a diesel grumble, low and steady, the kind of sound a working truck makes when it is carrying serious weight. It was not the sound of a pickup. It was not the sound of a tractor. It was the sound of something built in an era when trucks were built to haul real work and nothing else. Under the diesel grumble, if you listen, there was a second sound, a harder sound, a rhythmic thunk, 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 not mechanical, more like something iron settling against something iron with each revolution of a drive shaft. That was the cable tool rig itself secured on the flatbed of the truck, the sputter bit swaying slightly in its housing, the steel cables pressing against their keepers as the truck moved over the uneven road. The ground underneath the porch began to carry the approach before the eye could see it. Wendell felt the faintest tremor through the soles of his work boots, the vibration of 9 tons of truck and rig and equipment coming up the gravel road from the south. Clara, standing beside him, said, "I can feel it, Dad." Wendell said, "That is the weight of it. That is 37 years of what your grandfather taught me riding on top of that truck." Then they saw it. Over the rise at the south end of the property, the truck crested the small hill and came into view, and for a moment the sun caught it full, and it looked like something that had rolled out of a photograph from another time. It was a 1969 Bucyrus Erie cable tool drilling rig, the kind of equipment that had been drilling water wells across the Great Plains since before the First World War in essentially the same design. It was mounted on the bed of a 1964 Chevrolet C60 truck, the cab painted a dark green that had faded to the color of old pine needles, and on the driver's side door, in peeling white lettering that had once been white lettering, it said, "Crane Brothers Drilling, Oberlin, Kansas." A second truck followed it, a pickup carrying the 2-man crew and the supplies. The rig rolled up Wendell's lane at no more than 5 miles an hour. Orville Crane was behind the wheel of the lead truck. He brought the rig up, slowly pulled it through the gate that Wendell had opened an hour earlier, and guided it across the stubble of the cut wheat field to the stake Wendell had driven into the ground at the bend along the north fence. He set the parking brake. The diesel dropped to an idle. He swung down out of the cab. Orville was a square-shouldered man in a sun-faded pioneer seed corn cap, blue work shirt, jeans turned gray at the knees. He walked over to the stake Wendell had set. He looked at it. He crouched. He pressed the flat of his right hand against the earth the way a man checks a stove to see if it is warm, though Orville was not checking for heat. He was checking for something else. He held his hand there for perhaps 15 seconds. Then he stood up and he looked at Wendell and he said, "All right, we will go down right here." He did not ask any more questions about the site. The crew setup took just under 2 hours. The derrick was raised, the sputter bit was lowered. The water lines were run from the truck tank to prime the hole. The logbook was opened on a wooden folding table set up in the shade of the rig. By 10:30, the first impact of the bit against the ground rang across the quarter section, a deep metallic thud that you could feel in your chest if you were standing within 50 yards. Cable tool drilling works the way it has always worked. It is not fast. It does not pretend to be. A heavy chisel bit weighing over 1,000 pounds is lifted by cable and dropped against the ground over and over for hours and days at a time, pounding through clay and rock an inch or two at a time. Every few feet, the crew stops, bails out the loose cuttings with a baler on a second cable logs, what the hole has produced, and then resumes. A good cable tool crew can move through 50 feet of soft ground in a day and through 10 feet of hard rock, if the rock is not cooperating. It is patient work. It rewards patience. It punishes hurry. The first day, Tuesday, the hole went down from the surface to 50 feet through light, clay, and caliche, the pale, hard layer that sits under most of western Kansas. Orville logged it as expected material. At 50 feet, the bit broke into a sandstone layer. Orville stopped, bailed the hole, inspected the cuttings in his flat steel pan, rubbed them between his fingers. He said to Wendell, who had been sitting on a fence post, watching all morning, "That is the top of the perch table your old well was drawing from. You will see this sandstone go down to maybe 70 feet, maybe a little deeper. After that, we will find out what is under it." Wendell nodded. He did not ask for a projection. By the end of the first day, the hole was at 67 feet. Orville shut the rig down at 5:30. The crew covered the hole with a plywood cap and drove their pickup back to Oberlin. Orville stayed an extra 20 minutes, walked the site, once checked the cable tension, on the derrick made a note in his log, and then he got in the Chevy C60 and drove off down the gravel road. Bennett Rooker drove past twice that first day in his red F250. The first time was at 11 in the morning. The second time was at 3 in the afternoon. He did not stop either time. He did not wave. He slowed as he came, even with the drill sight, looked across the fence without expression, and then accelerated on past. Clara, standing on the porch at 3 when he went by the second time, said to her father later at supper, "He came by twice." Wendell said, "I know. I saw him." Let me tell you about the cost comparison that was running in Wendell's head that first evening, because any farmer over the age of 50 understands this kind of arithmetic by instinct. Orville had quoted $3,800 for drilling up to 200 feet. Every foot beyond 200 feet would cost an additional $18. So if the water came in at 160 feet, which Wendell thought possible, based on the geometry of the bend, the drill cost would stay at $3,800. If it came in at 180, also $3,800. If they had to push past 200, it started climbing. At 220 feet, the total would be 4,160. At 222 feet, the total would be 4,160, be 4,160. At 222 feet, the total would be 4,196. At 223 feet, Wendell would be over his $4,200 in the bank before the pump and the wiring and the permit. At 223 feet, he would be broke. Orville Crane had drilled enough wells in enough counties to know what a man's budget looked like on his face. That evening as he was leaving, Orville had said to Wendell without looking directly at him, "We will not charge you for the foot after 200 if we have to go past. We will absorb it." Wendell had said, "I cannot ask you to do that." Orville had said, "You did not ask." I offered, "Let me do my work my way." They had shaken hands and Orville had driven off. On Wednesday morning, day 2 of the drilling, the bit was at 67 feet and climbing down. The sandstone continued to 74 feet, then gave way to a layer of hard shale. The bit slowed. The thud of the impact change pitch went higher, rang off the steel of the derrick in a way that told Orville what the material was before he even pulled cuttings. At 85 feet, he pulled the bit and examined the cuttings. He crossed the stubble to where Wendell was sitting on the fence post, and he said, "We are into hard shale. Most drillers would stop about here. Most drillers would tell you the bedrock has closed under you. The book says this zone is not water-bearing beyond 90 feet. Wendell said, "Keep going." Orville looked at him. "How deep?" Wendell said. "Until you hit the channel my father found." Orville said, "Your father drilled to 125 feet, 250 yards south of here. We are going to end up going deeper than that at this angle, maybe quite a bit deeper. Based on what makes you think there is water below this shale at this exact spot. Let me understand what I am drilling for." Wendell stood up from the fence post. He walked with Orville back toward the rig, and as they walked, he explained what he had explained to nobody else except Clara and Merle Hoffstetter in full. The bend in the buffalo wallow on the surface was the surface expression of an ancient drainage that cut deeper than the wallow suggested. His father had drilled 250 yards south in 1936 because that was where the wallow was widest and the signs at the surface were clearest. But the channel itself bent at depth. It bent eastward and slightly northward as it moved away from his father's site, following the path of least resistance through the bedrock. At this specific bend in the wallow where the surface depression tightened and turned the channel at depth was also turning, and where a channel turns in buried rock, the water slows, and where water slows it collects, and the water table above the deep channel would be slightly higher there than anywhere else along the north line. His father had taught him that. His father had not ever drilled this exact spot because he had not needed to. But he had told Wendell one afternoon in 1954, when Wendell was 34 years old, and they were walking that fence line in April together, that if you ever needed more water than the south well could give, this bend is where you would find it, probably between 140 and 160 feet down. Orville Crane listened to all of this without interrupting. When Wendell was finished, Orville said, "Your father told you that 29 years ago?" Wendell said, "Yes." Orville said, "And you remembered it?" Wendell said, "I wrote it down that same night in a notebook. I still have the notebook." Orville was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We are going to drill through this shale. We will find out what is under it together." They drilled through Wednesday afternoon and into the evening. At 98 feet, the shale lightened, transitioned. At 108 feet, it was clearly thinning. At 115 feet, Orville stopped, pulled the bit, bailed the hole, and came across to Wendell with a pan of cuttings. He held it under the light. The material in the pan had a different character. It was coarser. It contained small, rounded grains. Orville said, "We are coming out of the shale. The next formation is going to tell us what we need to know." Wendell stood up off the fence post. He walked over and he looked at the pan. Clara came out of the house with a thermos of coffee and 3 sandwiches she had made from the bread Jim Pauley's wife had brought over that morning. She gave a sandwich to Orville, a sandwich to each of the 2 crewmen, and brought one back to her father. Wendell ate standing up looking at the drill rig. It was on Wednesday afternoon, about the time the bit was passing 110 feet, that the first neighbor arrived without having been called or invited. Jim Pauley pulled his 1976 Ford pickup into the gate and drove across the stubble and parked at a respectful distance from the rig. He did not get out at first. He just sat in the cab with the window down. After a few minutes, he opened the door and came over to where Wendell was sitting. He said, "Gloria made some sandwiches for you and for Clara. She thought you might be so busy watching you would forget to eat. She sent me out with them." Wendell said, "Tell her thank you, Jim." Jim said, "I will. I thought I would stay a while if that is all right." Wendell said, "It is all right." Jim pulled a folding chair out of the bed of his pickup. He sat down 10 feet from Wendell's fence post. He did not say anything else for almost an hour. He just watched the rig work. At 4 in the afternoon, Merle Hoffstetter's old white Dodge pulled in. Merle came out with a thermos of coffee bigger than the one Clara had brought earlier. He walked straight to the drill rig and gave the thermos to Orville's lead crewman and said, "You boys drink this." Then he came over to where Wendell and Jim were sitting. He said, "Wendell, mind if I stay?" Wendell said, "No, Merle, I do not mind." Merle pulled a second folding chair out of the trunk of the Dodge and sat down next to Jim Pauley. Nobody spoke. At 5 in the afternoon, Elton Brady came. Elton was 77 years old, had farmed 240 acres east of the Marsh place for 52 years, had retired 2 years earlier, and turned the operation over to his son, Donnie. Elton drove his old 1971 Ford pickup into the gate and parked behind Jim's pickup. He got out slowly, he walked over, and when he got to the fence post where Wendell was sitting, he did not sit down. He said, "Wendell, your father showed me where to drill a well on my north quarter in 1948. I hit water at 110 feet right where he said. That well carried me through every drought for 34 years. I still think about what he did for me. I heard in town that you were drilling today. I thought I would come by." Wendell looked up at him and said, "Thank you, Elton." Elton said no. "Thank him." He nodded at the dust of the field where Henry Marsh was not. Then he pulled a folding chair out of his truck and sat down next to Merle. At 5:30, Carl Weber came. Carl was 61, farmed 180 acres a mile west. He did not say anything. He just nodded at Wendell, nodded at the rig, and sat down on the tailgate of his truck. By 6 in the evening, there were 6 men on the edge of that field. 5 neighbors, and Orville Crane and Clara was standing on the porch of the farmhouse watching them, and the bit was at 128 feet and moving into material that Orville was starting to pay close attention to. At 138 feet, the bit passed through the last of the transitional layer. The cuttings in the pan changed again. Orville's lead crewman, a quiet man named Dale, who had been drilling with Orville for 11 years, pulled the baler up and looked at what it contained. He set the baler down. He walked over to Orville without saying anything, and he set the pan on the folding table, and Orville looked at the pan for a long moment. Then Orville walked across the stubble to the fence post where Wendell was sitting. He said, "Mr. Marsh, I want you to come look at something." Wendell stood up. He walked with Orville back to the table. He looked at the pan. What was in the pan was water-bearing gravel, coarse, rounded, mixed with fine sand. Orville said, "This is the formation. This is what we were drilling for. We should be within 5 feet of the water now, maybe less." Wendell did not say anything. He looked at the pan. He looked at Orville. He looked at the men sitting in folding chairs along the edge of the field. He looked at Clara on the porch. Let me tell you about what happened in the next 3 minutes, because those 3 minutes are the reason that story is still being told in Decatur County, Kansas, 43 years later. Orville went back to the rig. He gave the signal to Dale. The cable came up. The bit was lowered back into the hole. The hammer rose. It dropped. It rose. It dropped. The thud was different now, more hollow, the sound of a bit working in loose material rather than solid rock. 3 more cycles. 4, 5. At 141 feet, the bit broke through into open water. It did not announce itself with anything dramatic. There was no gush, no spray. Cable tool drilling does not work that way. What happened was that Dale, monitoring the cable, felt the bit stop resisting, felt it drop freely for 1.5 feet before the cable went tight again against the bottom. He called to Orville. Orville came over. They pulled the bit. When the baler came up a few minutes later, it came up wet, not damp, wet, water dripping off the sides as it rose. Orville walked the baler over to the folding table and emptied it into the pan, and the pan filled with clear water that had the faint blue tint of water that has been underground for a very long time. Orville looked at Wendell. He said, "We are in it. Let me get the pump set up. We will do a flow test. It is going to take about an hour for the hole to clear." "Just hang on," Wendell nodded. He walked back to his fence post. He sat down. "Let me tell you what I want you to picture now." Sun was getting low in the western sky. The light had gone gold across the stubble. A single red-tailed hawk was circling high over the draw to the south, riding the last thermal of the day. The 5 men on the folding chairs in the tailgate were silent. Clara had come down from the porch and was standing near the folding table watching the pan. Orville and Dale were at the rig setting up the test pump. The pump started at 7 minutes past 6 in the evening. The first water that came up was murky with drilling residue. Orville said, "We will let this clear. Might take 30 minutes. Might take an hour." We sit and we wait. They sat and they waited. At 6:30, the water was beginning to clear. At 6:45, it was clear, running through the discharge hose onto the stubble, making a small temporary pond at the edge of the hole. Orville crouched at the discharge. He let some of it run over his hand. He cupped a palmful. He smelled it. He tasted it, just a drop at the tip of his tongue. He stood up. He said, "That is cold water. That is real cold. 44 degrees, maybe 43. That is not perch table water. That is deep water. That is water that has traveled a long way underground through deep gravel." He set up the flow gauge. At 7 in the evening, the first reading came in. Orville called it out. 12 gallons per minute, still climbing, 7:15. 14 gallons per minute, 7:30. 16 gallons per minute steady, 7:45. 17 gallons per minute, no drawdown. 8 in the evening, 18 gallons per minute, holding, 8:15, 19 gallons per minute, still climbing slightly, 8:30, 20 gallons per minute, 8:45, 21 gallons per minute, 9 in the evening, 22 gallons per minute, stable for the last 15 minutes. No drawdown detected. Orville closed the flow test log. He walked over to the folding table and he set the log down. He took his Pioneer seed corn cap off. He rubbed his forehead with the back of his forearm. He stood there for a moment looking at the log. Then he walked across the stubble to the fence post where Wendell was sitting. He said, "Mr. Marsh, I have drilled 47 wells in the last year. 19 of them came in with less water than you have got right here on this north fence line. You have not found a well. You have found a river running underneath your own property at 141 feet, exactly where you said it would be." Wendell did not speak for a long moment. He looked at the water still running from the discharge, clear and cold, now making a pond that was spreading slowly into the wheat stubble and darkening the dry ground as it spread. He thought about his father sitting on the running board of the first Crane's drilling truck in the summer of 1936, saying that the knowledge has to be inside you before the crisis comes. He thought about 47 April mornings walking the north fence line. He thought about Eleanor saying in the spring of 1969, "Wendell, you walk that same path every April, like it is church," and how he had said, "Eleanor, it is." He felt something that was quieter and more permanent than any word that describes winning. He felt that his father had been right about everything that mattered. He said, "Thank you, Orville." Orville put his cap back on. He said, "Thank your father." Let me tell you about Bennett Rooker. He had driven past the site twice on Tuesday. He had driven past twice on Wednesday morning. On Wednesday evening at about 7:30, he drove past a third time, saw the pump running, saw the 6 men standing at the edge of the field, and he kept going. He drove half a mile down the county road and he pulled off onto the shoulder and he sat in the red F250 with the engine running for nearly 10 minutes. Then he turned the truck around and he drove back. But this time, instead of passing the site, he pulled off onto the shoulder directly across from the fence, 100 yards from the drill rig, and he stopped. He did not get out. He did not turn off the engine. He rolled down his window. What he saw from the cab of the truck was clear water pumping out of a hole in the ground that Wendell Marsh had paid $3,800 to drill at a spot that Bennett would have bet every acre of his 520-acre operation was dead ground. He saw the 5 neighbors sitting in folding chairs and on a tailgate watching. He saw Orville Crane take his cap off and rub his forehead. He saw Wendell Marsh sitting on a fence post, not standing, not celebrating, not looking across the road at Bennett, not looking anywhere in particular. Bennett did not roll up his window. He did not say anything to anyone. He sat there for a long time. The light kept going, the water kept coming. Finally, he put the truck in gear and he turned it around and he drove back toward his house. He did not wave. He did not look back. At the drill site, nobody was celebrating. There was no cheering, no clapping. Elton Brady took off his cap, looked up at the darkening sky where the first star had just appeared in the east, put the cap back on. He did not say anything. Merle Hoffstetter walked over to where Wendell was sitting. He put his hand on Wendell's shoulder the same way he had put it there in the co-op on Friday afternoon. He said, "Your father would be proud of you today, Wendell." Clara came up behind her father and wrapped both her arms around his shoulders from behind and rested her chin on the top of his head, the way she had done when she was a small girl, and she did not say anything at all. Jim Pauley walked over. He did not put his hand on Wendell. He just stood there. He said, "I will be back in the morning with Gloria. She is going to bring you breakfast. You are going to sit and eat it." Wendell said, "All right, Jim." Carl Weber folded his chair back into his truck. He walked over, he shook Wendell's hand once firmly, and walked back to his truck without speaking, got and drove off. Elton Brady was the last to leave. He walked over to Wendell. He said, "Wendell, if you ever find yourself on my north quarter, you remember your father drilled there too." Wendell said, "I remember Elton." Elton nodded once and walked back to his truck. Orville Crane and Dale finished closing up the site just before 10 that night. The final bill when Orville wrote it up that evening at the folding table by the light of a battery lantern came to $3,800 for the drilling, exactly the quoted number. Orville had absorbed the extra $18 for the foot past 140, as he had promised. The pump installation, which Orville and Dale would complete the next morning, would be $340. The electrical permit from the county would be $58. Total $4,198. Wendell had $2 in the bank when it was all said and done. The water ran all night. The irrigation lines were connected to the new pump by Thursday noon. By Thursday evening, water was flowing across the south field into the crusted furrows between the rows of curled seed corn. Within 48 hours, the outer leaves began to flatten. Within 72 hours, the pale yellow began to deepen back toward green. First at the base of the plants, then up the stems, then spreading outward into the canopy. The pollination came in on schedule. The tassels emerged. The silks took. The seed corn was going to make it. 87 acres saved with $498, and a lesson that a man's father had taught him in the summer of 1936. But let me tell you what happened next, because Bennett Rooker's story was not over. It was just beginning. And the real reckoning between the two men who stood at that fence line on a Wednesday afternoon in August of 1983 was still 6 years away. The harvest came in on the first Tuesday of October 1983. The pioneer high-bred fieldman came out in a white International Scout to inspect the seed corn before the combine rolled, and he walked the rows slowly with his clipboard checking kernel, fill, checking the ear size, checking the moisture content with his little hand probe. When he was finished, he came back to where Wendell was sitting on the fender of the 1966 John Deere 402. "Oh," and he said, "Mr. Marsh, this is as good a stand of contract seed corn as I have inspected in Decatur County this year. Your yield is going to come in at 165 bushels an acre at least. The contract premium pays out full. You are looking at about $32,400 for this 87 before expenses." Wendell said, "Thank you." The young man nodded, got back in his Scout, and drove off toward Oberlin. Clara had gone back to Lincoln after the second weekend of drilling. She had taken Wendell's notebook with her, the one he had written in since 1936, the one where Henry Marsh's words about the bend in the Buffalo Wallow were recorded in a 16-year-old boy's careful pencil. She had taken it only long enough to read it through once in the evenings in her small apartment. She had brought it back with her in the second week of September when she came down for a weekend to help Wendell finish preparing the combine. She had handed it back to him at the kitchen table without saying anything about what she had read. On the first Saturday of November, after the seed corn was delivered and the check had cleared at the First State Bank of Oberlin, Wendell drove into town for a sack of feed and a box of 12 penny nails. He parked in front of Hoffstetter's co-op, and he went inside, and he was standing at the counter, paying Merle for the feed, when the bell on the door jingled and Bennett Rooker walked in. Bennett stopped just inside the door. Wendell turned from the counter. They looked at each other across maybe 15 feet of co-op floor under the bare bulb of the hanging light, with the smell of cattle cubes and leather and diesel in the air between them. The store was otherwise empty. Merle Hoffstetter behind the counter did not move. Bennett spoke first. He said, "Wendell." His voice was not loud. It was not the voice from the fence line on that Wednesday afternoon in August. It was a smaller voice, a voice that had done some thinking between August and November. Wendell said, "Bennett." Bennett said, "I heard you got 22 gallons a minute." Wendell said, "That is what I got." Bennett said, "At 141 feet." Wendell said, "Yes." Bennett looked down at the wood plank floor of the co-op. He looked at his own boots. He did not say anything else. After about 10 seconds, he nodded once, not at Wendell, but at himself, and he turned around and he walked back out. The bell on the door jingled. The door closed. He was gone. Merle Hoffstetter said softly, "That is the hardest thing Bennett Rooker has said in 30 years. Wendell paid for the feed. He picked up his sack. He walked out to his truck. The mortgage payment for October went through on the 15th. The input costs for the 1983 crop year were covered. Wendell had almost $18,000 left in the account by Thanksgiving, the most cash he had held at one time since 1972. He paid down the mortgage principal by $8,000, which bought him 3 years of payments in advance. He put $6,000 into a certificate of deposit at 10.25%. He kept the rest in checking. Bennett Rooker did not drive past Wendell's fence line on the county road between November of 1983 and the spring of 1984. He took a different route when he had to go east. Wendell knew this. Merle Hoffstetter knew it. The county is small enough that nobody has to be told these things. Let me tell you about what happened to Bennett Rooker's wells between the autumn of 1983 and the spring of 1989, because this is the part of the story that people in Decatur County still tell, though they tell it quietly and usually only after the second cup of coffee. In the early summer of 1984, Bennett's number 3 pivot, the one he had drilled in 1976 with federal cost share, began to lose pressure. He paid $450 a day for a hydrogeologist from Kansas State University to come out and evaluate. The hydrogeologist took 3 days, walked the property with instruments, consulted his Kansas Geological Survey maps, and delivered a report. The perch water table under the southwest quarter of Bennett's operation had drawn down from continuous pivot irrigation over 12 years, and it was not going to recover quickly. He recommended reducing irrigation or exploring for a deeper source, though he warned that the bedrock in that zone did not favor access to the deeper Ogallala. His report cost Bennett $1,350. In 1985, Bennett paid to have the number 3 well deepened by 40 feet at a cost of $3,200. It helped for half a season. By August of 1985, the pressure was dropping again. In 1986, Bennett's number 2, the one from 1974 started showing the same decline. He brought in a second hydrogeologist, this one from an engineering firm in Denver. That consultation cost $2,100 and produced substantially the same report as the first one in different language and with different maps. Surface geology not favoring deep access. Exploratory drilling would cost $22,000 minimum with no guarantee of results. Bennett did not drill. He could not afford to. Through 1986 and 1987, his corn yields on the irrigated ground dropped from the 180 bushel average he had run for a decade down to 138 bushels, then to 121. His input costs stayed the same. The margin disappeared. In the spring of 1988, Farm Credit called Bennett's operating loan. He had $360,000 of debt against equipment, pivots, and land, and the collateral had depreciated to where the bank could no longer carry the exposure. Bennett sold 140 acres of his original 520, the northwest quarter, plus 2 40-acre parcels to a land investment company out of Kansas City at $730 an acre. The sale cleared the operating loan, and left him with 380 acres, one functioning pivot, and about $8,400 in a savings account that had once held 10 times that much. His wife Doreen got a part-time job keeping the books for the veterinary practice in Oberlin for $4.25 an hour. Between 1984 and the spring of 1989, Bennett Rooker had spent $1,350 on the first hydrogeologist, $3,200 on the deepening, $2,100 on the second hydrogeologist, somewhere near $11,000 on hauled water during the worst two summers, and roughly $20,000 in lost yield revenue. The total came to a number close to $37,000 of expense and loss trying to solve a problem that his neighbor, Wendell Marsh, had solved for $4,198 in 3 days in August of 1983. Bennett knew the arithmetic. Bennett was not a stupid man. Bennett had known the arithmetic since about 1986 and had been unable to do anything with it. On a Thursday morning in April of 1989, the 6th April after the well came in on the Marsh place, Bennett Rooker's red truck, which was now a 1984 model, and not a 1989, pulled into Wendell Marsh's lane. He parked, he got out. His belt buckle was the same silver buckle he had always worn, though the finish had dulled. His boots were older. He walked across the yard slowly, his hands at his sides, his eyes on the ground for most of the first few steps. When he looked up, his face had the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say many times across many nights, and had finally stopped finding reasons to put it off. Wendell came out of the equipment shed. He wiped his hands on a shop rag. He waited. Bennett stopped about 6 feet from him. He said, "Wendell, I have been meaning to come for 6 years. I kept finding reasons not to. I want to tell you why I'm here now. My number 2 well is dead. Number 3 is pulling air every afternoon. Number 1 is giving me 9 gallons a minute and falling. I have sold 140 acres. I have been to 2 hydrogeologists and 3 drilling companies, and none of them has given me a path forward. I have $8,400 in the bank. At my age, that is not going to recover by itself. I know what I said at the fence in August of 1983. I have known since about a week after I said it that I was wrong. I have known every single day since then. I never figured out how to tell you. Then it got too late. Now it is past too late, but I am here anyway. I am asking for your help." He stopped. He did not add anything. He did not try to soften it or dress it up. Wendell let the words settle, not to make Bennett uncomfortable, not to collect any kind of satisfaction, but because some things deserve a moment of stillness before they are answered, and because Wendell Marsh had been raised by a man who believed that the truth of a moment should be fully present before anyone moves past it. Then Wendell said, "Bennett, come inside. I will make some coffee." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Wendell had done the arithmetic with a pencil and a lined tablet 6 years earlier. Clara had divorced her husband in Lincoln the previous summer. She had driven down from Lincoln for the weekend to help Wendell with some spring work around the place, and she was at the counter pouring coffee. Bennett nodded at her when he came in. She nodded back. She put the 2 cups on the table, and she went upstairs to give them the kitchen to themselves. Bennett laid it all out plainly. The decline the hydrogeologist reports, the drilling estimates, the land sale, the yield losses. Wendell listened to all of it without interrupting. When Bennett finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the tick of the old wind-up clock on the shelf over the refrigerator. Wendell said, "Bennett, walk your northwest quarter with me. The part that drops down toward the old section road where the grass stays green into July when the rest of your pasture has gone brown." Bennett looked at him. "That is 400 yards from any of my existing wells." "I know where it is," Wendell said. "I have looked at your land from my fence line for 22 years. There is a feature in that corner that most people would walk past without noticing. A slight depression that runs roughly east to west, not much, maybe 14 inches of relief across 80 yards, but it is there." He paused. "My father taught me that surface depressions like that one are often the surface expression of ancient drainages, Old channels that have been dry on the surface for 1,000 years, but that sit on top of deep geology that still carries water. The water follows the ancient geometry because the geometry is still there, 100 feet down, 150 feet down, 200 feet down, as solid and real as the day it was carved. Bennett was quiet. Then he said, "Your father taught you that." "In the summer of 1936, Wendell said. "I was 16 years old. He walked me to the north fence and showed me what he saw and explained what it meant. I have walked that fence line every April since. I kept the knowledge current. I made sure I still understood what he had given me. I did the same thing with your northwest quarter from my side of the fence for 22 years. Not because I was planning anything, just because the land on your side of the fence is still land and the same rules apply." He looked at Bennett with the steady gaze of a man who had long since made his peace with the full story. "I knew what was underneath my own property in 1983 before my well ever went dry. I came to you first that Tuesday because buying access to your well was faster and cheaper than drilling my own, and because you were my neighbor and it seemed worth asking." Bennett received that without looking away. It was the plainest possible account of what had happened 6 years earlier, delivered without anger and without any reaching for effect. It was harder to hear for exactly that reason. He said, "Wendell, I am sorry for what I said at the fence, for the way I said it, for 6 years of being too stubborn to come over here." Wendell nodded once. "I know you are," he said. They drove to Bennett's northwest quarter that afternoon in Bennett's truck. Wendell moved slowly along the barely perceptible depression in the topography, stopping every 30 feet or so to press his boot into the soil, crouching once to pick up a handful of earth and feel it and smell it. At a point where the depression curved slightly toward the north, where the soil held a quality that matched what he had learned to look for, he pressed both palms flat against the ground and he held them there the way his father had shown him in 1936, the way he had practiced every April for 53 years, and he felt the thing he had learned to feel. He stood up. He said, "Drill here, 155 feet, maybe 165. The channel that runs under my property bends this direction at depth. Your ground sits further from where the surface drainage ran, which is why the signs on the surface are fainter. But the deep geology does not care about what the surface shows. The water is there." Bennett said the hydrogeologist from Kansas State walked this corner in 1984. He did not identify anything. Wendell said he was reading his maps and running his instruments. Maps record what instruments detected at a particular time. The ground holds what has been true for 10,000 years, and it will tell you if you know how to listen to it. You have to put your hands in the dirt. There is no instrument that does what that does. There never has been. There never will be. Bennett called Crane Brothers Drilling that same afternoon from the telephone in his kitchen. Orville Crane was 60 years old by then, and his son Lee was working alongside him in the company now, but Orville took the call himself. Orville said, "I will come out Monday morning, Mr. Rooker. I will bring the rig." Crane Brothers drilled on Bennett's northwest quarter the following week. They went down 157 feet and hit the channel. 19 gallons per minute. Steady, cold water. They completed the well on Thursday afternoon of that week. Orville wrote the bill for $400, including pump installation. Bennett paid by check the same day. When Orville was loading up the rig and getting ready to drive out, Bennett walked over to where Wendell was standing by the fence watching the final work. Bennett said, "Wendell, what do I owe you for this? You drove me to the spot. You told me where to drill. I do not know what the right number is, but I will write a check for whatever you say." Wendell said, "Bennett, you do not owe me anything." Bennett said, "Why?" Wendell looked across the pasture toward the section of the Ogallala that neither of them could see, and both of them knew was there, holding in cold dark gravel the water that had carried his farm through the dry August of 1983 and was now going to carry Bennett's farm through whatever was coming next. He said, "Bennett, the ground was never the problem. It was what we brought to it. My father taught me that the land does not keep a ledger. It just tends what tends it. A neighbor who is struggling is a problem that belongs to all of us, not just to him. He paused. The man I was raised by would have told me the same thing whether you had laughed at me in 1983 or not. I am not going to be less of my father's son because of what you said at a fence line 6 years ago. Neither should you. Bennett stood there for a long moment. He did not try to respond. He put his hand out and Wendell took it, and they shook once and Bennett walked back to his truck. Let me tell you what happened in the years that followed. The story of Wendell Marsh and Bennett Rooker from that April forward was really two stories running in parallel on two adjacent pieces of Kansas ground under the same sun, but with something changed between them that was not going to change back. Bennett reduced his operation to 380 acres. He ran one pivot, the new well carried it, and he paid off his remaining farm credit debt by the end of 1994. He was 69 years old that year. He and Doreen kept the place together, but they did not expand again, and they did not try to. Bennett sold cattle at the Oberlin sale barn every third Thursday of the month. He did not speak loudly there anymore. He wore the same silver buckle until it broke in 1997, and then he stopped wearing a buckle at all. Wendell kept farming the 87 acres. Let me give you the years the way he lived them. In 1984, the seed corn came in at 158 bushels the acre below. 1983, but still strong. Pioneer renewed the contract. The well held steady at 22 gallons per minute. Wendell had $19,000 in the bank at year-end. In 1985, a regional drought hit. Half of Decatur County was hauling water by August. Wendell's well did not falter. He cleared $24,000 on the crop and began paying the mortgage down faster. In 1986, the payment-in-kind program was still in effect and corn prices were low, but Wendell made $28,000. The mortgage balance was down to $22,000. In 1987, the flow test on the well in March came back at 23 gallons per minute, a slight increase after a wet spring. Wendell had the barn repainted for the first time since 1971. The color was the same barn red that Henry Marsh had used in 1947. In 1988, the summer drought was worse than 1983. National news spoke of the worst Corn Belt drought since the Dust Bowl. Wendell's well did not falter. 3 farms within 5 miles of the Marsh place were foreclosed on that fall. Wendell cleared $31,000, the best year of his life. In 1989, the April that Bennett Rooker came up the lane, the mortgage paid off in November. 87 acres free and clear. Wendell was 69 years old. In 1990, Clara moved back from Lincoln permanently after her divorce. She was 45. She took a teaching job in Oberlin at the middle school and began helping her father with the farm on weekends and through the summer. In 1991, Wendell walked the north fence line with Clara every April morning that spring. He showed her everything his father had shown him in 1936. The frost signs, the soil darkness, the bend in the buffalo wallow. He taught her to press her palms flat against the ground at the bend and hold them there. He told her, Clara, the water does not disappear. It just goes somewhere else. Your job is to figure out where it went. Clara said, I know, Dad. I remember you telling me when I was small. He said, I am telling you again, because the knowledge has to be inside you now, not just remembered, inside you. She said, all right. In 1992, the well tested at 22 gallons per minute. Clara took over the April walk by herself with Wendell was driving his truck alongside her on the county road to watch. From 1993 through 1997, the years went one after another without drama. Wendell was 73, Yevgeny was 75, 76, 77. He farmed less directly each season. Clara did more. The well produced without complaint. The mortgage was gone. The farm had money in the bank. Wendell bought a Ford pickup in 1995, used a 1991 model. It was the first newer vehicle he had owned since 1968. In 1998, Wendell's knees gave out in March. Arthritis that he had been hiding for 5 years. He could no longer climb onto the tractor without help. Clara took over full operation. Wendell sat on the porch many afternoons watching her work the field he had worked for 62 years. Between 1989 and 1998, across the 9 years after Bennett Rooker walked up the lane, Wendell Marsh helped 6 other farmers in Decatur and Norton counties locate deep wells on ground that the hydrogeologists and engineering firms had told them was unreachable. He did not take money for it. He walked their land. He pressed his palms to the earth at the places where the signs told him to. He marked the spot with a wooden stake. He told them what depth to expect. Crane brothers drilled 4 of those 6. A different company drilled the other 2. All 6 came in within 5 feet of the depth Wendell had predicted, and all 6 produced between 16 and 24 gallons per minute. The combined acreage saved by those 6 wells came to approximately 2,800 acres. 5 of those 6 operations were still farming in 2020. Wendell did not ever charge for his knowledge. When one of the farmers, a younger man named Lucas Hartmann on the Norton County line, tried to pay him $500 after Crane brothers hit water on his property at 148 feet, in the summer of 1993, Wendell gave the money back. He said, "Lucas, I did not find that water. Your land found it. I just listened." Lucas said, "But you knew where to listen." Wendell said, "So will your son if you walk the land with him and if you teach him what to listen for. That is how I want to be paid." Lucas Hartmann's son Caleb was 6 years old that summer. Lucas walked his north quarter with Caleb every April from 1994 onward. By the time Caleb took over the Hartmann farm in 2018, he could read the surface signs of his own ground almost as well as Wendell had read the Marsh 87. Let me tell you about the day the generational echo came home to the Marsh farm. In the summer of 2001, Clara Marsh was 56 years old and running the 87 acres by herself, though she kept her teaching job in Oberlin half-time. Her older sister, Miriam, who had lived in Topeka since 1964 with her husband, Gene, had a grandson named Tyler Voss. Tyler was 17 that summer, going into his senior year at a high school in Topeka. He was a quiet boy. His parents sent him to the farm for 6 weeks in July and August to work with Clara and Wendell. Wendell was 81 that summer. He could still walk, but not far. He spent most of the day sitting on the porch with the old notebook from 1936 on his lap. On the first Saturday of August, Clara woke Tyler up at 5:30 in the morning. She made him pancakes and fried eggs. At 6, they walked out the back door of the farmhouse and across the yard toward the north fence line. Clara said, "Tyler, my father walked this fence line with his father in 1936. He walked it by himself every April for 47 years after that. Then he walked it with me when I was little and again when I came back home. I want to walk it with you this morning. I want to tell you what my grandfather told my father. I want to tell you what my father told me." Tyler said, "All right, Aunt Clara." They walked slowly. At the bend in the buffalo wallow, Clara stopped. She said, "Tyler, your great-grandfather, Henry Marsh, stopped at this exact spot in the summer of 1936, and he taught my father how to read this ground. He taught him that the water does not disappear. It just goes somewhere else. He taught him that the job of a man who works the land is to figure out where it went." She crouched. She pressed her palms flat against the earth. She said like this. She held them there. Tyler crouched beside her. He pressed his own palms against the soil. He was quiet. They stayed there for a long time, the boy and the woman at the bend in an old buffalo wallow on 87 acres of Kansas ground, with the sun coming up behind them. 4 generations of that knowledge passed through that ground. Ezra Marsh to Henry, Henry to Wendell, Wendell to Clara, Clara to Tyler. Wendell died on a Thursday morning in October of 2004. He was 84 years old. His heart failed quietly in his sleep. Clara found him still in bed when she came in with coffee at 7. The funeral was held the following Sunday afternoon at the Lutheran Church in Oberlin. The sanctuary held 180 people, and there were people standing along the back wall and out in the narthex. Farmers from 5 counties came. Orville Crane came. He was 75 by then, retired, though Crane brothers drilling was still in business under his son Lee. Merle Hoffstetter had died in 1996, but his widow Ruth came. Elton Brady had died in 1997, but his son Donnie came. Jim Pauley came. Carl Weber came. Bennett Rooker came. He was 79. He walked in on his own, but with a cane. Doreen was not with him. She had died of cancer in 2001. He came up to Clara at the reception in the church fellowship hall. He took both of her hands in his for a long moment. He did not try to speak. He did not try to say anything about anything that had happened. He just held her hands. Then he let go and he nodded once and he walked out to the parking lot and he got in an old Chevy Silverado that had replaced the red Ford years earlier and he drove home. Clara farmed the 87 acres until 2019 when she was 74. She sold it then to the Hartmann family, to Lucas and Caleb, because Caleb had a son of his own by then, a boy named Eli, who was 10 years old, and Clara wanted the farm to go to a family that would walk the north fence line in April. The Hartmans paid her fair market value, which was about $2,200 an acre that year. Clara used part of the money to set up a small scholarship at Oberlin High School in the names of Henry Marsh, Wendell Marsh, and Eleanor Marsh. It goes to one graduating senior each year who plans to study agriculture. Caleb Hartmann walks the north fence line of the old Marsh 87 every April now. He takes his son Eli with him. They stop at the bend in the Buffalo Wallow. They press their palms flat against the ground. They hold them there. The well that Orville Crane drilled on the Marsh place in August of 1983 is still producing water today. The pump has been replaced twice. The casing is original. The depth is 141 feet. The last flow test conducted in the spring of 2024 came back at 21.5 gallons per minute. 41 years of service and still within a gallon of what it gave the day it came in. Let me tell you the lesson, because a story like this one has a lesson in it if we know how to listen for it. Today, farmland in Decatur County, Kansas averages about $2,400 an acre. Young farmers in that county face the same drought pressures their grandfathers faced, only worse, because the Ogallala Aquifer has dropped another 30 feet since 1983, and there are fewer Henry Marshes left to teach the reading of the land. The ground has not changed, though. It still tells the truth to anyone who knows how to listen to it. The truth is just underneath. It is always just underneath. The lesson is not complicated. A man who spent 47 years walking the same fence line every spring knew more about his specific piece of ground than every hydrogeologist who ever drove down from Manhattan, Kansas with a briefcase and a clipboard and a bill for $450 a day. Knowledge handed down father to son, properly kept, walked into the body of the next generation until it lives in their hands, and their feet is worth more than any consultant fee anyone will ever charge. Money will find equipment. Money will find credit. Money will not find 40 years of looking that a father gives a son and a mother gives a daughter. That knowledge is either passed along or it dies when the man who holds it dies. There is no third option. Have you been holding something that should be passed along? Something your father or your mother or your grandfather taught you that the next generation in your family needs? Do not wait for the crisis to start teaching. By the time the crisis comes, it is too late. The knowledge has to be inside them before they need it. It has to have been inside them for a long time. Wendell Marsh walked the north fence line 47 Aprils before he ever needed what his father had shown him. 47 Aprils of what most men would have called wasted mornings. 47 Aprils that saved 87 acres of seed corn in August of 1983, and then saved 380 acres of his neighbor's operation in April of 1989, and then saved 2,800 acres across Decatur and Norton counties in the decade that followed, and then passed on to a daughter and a grandnephew, and eventually to a boy named Eli Hartmann, who is probably walking that fence line right now as this story reaches its end. The water does not disappear. Neither does what our fathers taught us. Both go somewhere else, and they wait there for someone who knows how to find them again. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments about one thing your father or your grandfather taught you that you have never forgotten. Tell me one lesson from the old days that you are trying to pass on to the young people in your life. If you believe stories like this one are worth keeping alive, subscribe and stick with us. There are more old farmers with lessons worth passing along, and we are going to tell their stories one at a time, the right way, in their own time. And if you know someone who is thinking about selling the place, their father left them because the bank has made it hard and the neighbors have made it lonely, share this with them. Because sometimes what is underneath the ground is worth more than the price that anyone on the surface is willing to pay for it. Thanks for listening. We will see you next time.